Stable, okay. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Katie Cosgrove, and my pronouns are she and her. A few people from this community have reached out to me and mentioned this topic to me of election grief and anxiety, something that they're personally concerned about for themselves and the world at large. But before I dive in, I want to remind us that as we gather here today, we're united by a desire to connect with something larger than ourselves. As a community, we celebrate the diversity of thought and experience that makes each of us unique, while also honoring the values that are shared that bind us together. Today, we will reflect on the themes of election grief, accepting change, and reclaiming our sense of empowerment in a world that can sometimes feel unstable. I also want to note that I will talk about the what ifs and the maybes today, but that is not a sense of preemptive defeat, yet a preparation for what may come in hopes and action that it doesn't. Let us begin by centering ourselves, because this can be a heavy conversation. Let's take a big, deep breath in through our nose and a big, deep breath out through our mouth. Feel the ground beneath your feet, the air around you, and the presence of each other in this sacred space. Here, we are held in love and compassion, ready to explore our emotions, our fears, and our hopes. Election seasons are often a time of heightened emotions: hope, anxiety, fear, excitement, anger, camaraderie, despair. Regardless of the outcome, these moments carry an immeasurable impact in how we see our world and our future. In the wake of an election, it's common to feel a sense of anticipatory grief, which is a sense of sorrow before something happens or a loss occurs. This grief is real, and it's important that we acknowledge it as such. Grief comes when we lose something meaningful, whether it's in the future we envisioned, a sense of progress we believed was forthcoming, safety for ourselves, or hope that a particular leader or policy would bring about positive change. This grief, though deeply personal, is often shared in the wider community. It's a collective experience, a mourning not only for ourselves, but the broader world that we care about. In this space, I invite us to hold our anticipated grief close to our heart, recognizing that it comes from a place of love. We grieve because we care. We care about justice, compassion, equality, and the well-being of all people. And in a world where these values can feel very fragile, it's natural to feel a deep sense of loss when they seem very threatened. Have you ever heard the phrase, "The only thing that stays the same is change"? Change is one of life's constants, whether we are prepared for it or not. In fact, much of the tension we feel around elections and other major life events stems from our desire to resist change, to hold on to the world as it is, or as we planned it to be. But change is inevitable. Seasons shift, people grow older, and societies evolve, and political landscapes fluctuate. It's in our nature to want stability and predictability, but life rarely grants us that luxury for very long, unfortunately. In her poem, The Peace of Wild Things, Wendell Berry writes, "When despair for the world grows in me, I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with the forethought of grief." There's wisdom in this. Learning to live in the present moment, accepting the flow of life, and trusting in our ability to adapt to whatever comes next. But accepting change doesn't mean that we need to abandon hope or give up on the world as we wish to see. Rather, it invites us to engage with life from a place of humility and resilience. It asks us to recognize that while we may not control everything, we can still respond to change with grace, creativity, and a commitment to our values. Acceptance, well, it's hard. It's not easy to accept the state of the world, politicians you don't agree with, people who have different values than you. But it is also the greatest tool we have in our tool belt. I want to invite an important term into this message: radical. For those of you who are hip in the 70s, I'm not talking about, wow, that's radical, man. But instead, I'm saying that pursuing something beyond the norm. As Tara Brach writes, radical acceptance rests on letting go of the illusion of control and the willingness to notice and accept things as they are right now without judging. Without judging. That's key here. We wouldn't be humans if we didn't have an affinity for judgment. Sometimes judging is a survival tactic, but sometimes it creates a divide that makes it impossible to see the other people as they are. Imperfect people with imperfect humans with a lot of parts, personalities, values, concerns, and fears. When we embrace radical acceptance, we begin to cultivate the space for understanding and compassion, not just for others, but for ourselves. This is the moment where acceptance transforms into action, a deep willingness to act from love, even when it feels challenging or uncertain. By moving from acceptance to action, we align ourselves with a force greater than fear, one that is rooted in love and resilience. It is in this spirit that we recognize our interdependence and the collective strength we share. Radical acceptance makes space for radical love, and through that love, we find the courage to support one another in ways that create meaningful change. This type of love does take a lot of courage. Terrence Real writes, "Love is not for the faint-hearted. It requires courage to fight for what you believe in." Interestingly enough, Reverend Michelle taught me earlier this week that the Latin root of courage is cor, which translates to heart. Courage starts with our heart. As we think about courage, it's important to acknowledge that true bravery also requires vulnerability. To face our fears, including the uncertainty of election outcomes, means allowing ourselves to feel grief, feel our anxiety, and feel our hopes without pushing them away. This is where the heart of community plays such a crucial role. We need one another in order to hold space for these emotions, to remind us that even when the world feels unstable, we aren't facing it alone. The courage to show up for one another is, in itself, an act of radical love, and the kind that transforms both our individual hearts and the world around us. One of the most important resources we have when facing grief and change is each other. As a Unitarian Universalist congregation, we affirm the interconnectedness web of existence. The interconnectedness is not just an abstract idea, it's a reality. We rely on one another in times of joy and sorrow, in moments of celebration and uncertainty, and our gathering of such a community is already radical. Reverend Michelle shared a powerful quote with me by Charles Einstein that goes, "We are inseparate from the universe, and our being partakes in the being of everyone and everything else." This is particularly true in the face of election grief and societal change. When we feel powerless, it's easy to isolate ourselves, to retreat into our own fear or anger, but community is the antidote to that. Together we can hold each other's grief, knowing that it will not overwhelm us. Together we can share our hopes for the future, recognizing that none of us must carry this burden and hope alone. In the moments of political transition, we are reminded that democracy is a collective act. No single person or group can create change alone. It requires a multitude of voices and efforts. Likewise, in our personal and spiritual lives, we find strength and inspiration when we come together as a community. Today, as we navigate our feelings about change, whether in our personal lives, in our nation, or in our world, let us remember that we are not alone. Here, we lift each other up. Here, we can listen deeply to another's fears and hopes, and here we can find strength to move together. Grief, when left unchecked, can lead to a sense of helplessness. We may feel that the world is slipping away from us, that the forces of injustice and inequality are too great to overcome. But despair is not the end of our story. It's simply part of the journey. When we grieve, we are acknowledging that something precious has been lost or is missing. But grief can also be an entrance to empowerment. It invites us to ask, what can we do now? How can we contribute to the healing and transformation of our communities, our nation, and our world? UU values assume that each of us have inherent worth and dignity. We are all agents of change. While we may not always win the battles we hope to win, the broader fight for justice continues on, especially when we refuse to give up. Each of us, in our own way, plays a role in shaping that effort. Whether we do so through activism, art, conversation, or simply living lives that are rooted in compassion, we are a vital part of a movement that is moving towards a just and loving world. This translates to helping out in the food pantry, donating clothes, greeting newcomers to the building, volunteering as a worship associate, or just living a life full of love and welcoming and belonging. And so much more that I can't mention in one sentence. This is where empowerment begins, not in the grand, sweeping victories, but in the small, persistent actions that remind us of our power to make a difference. We may not be able to control the outcome of every election or every direction of policy, but we can control how we respond. We can choose to be a force for good, even in the face of disappointment or joy. As we prepare to leave the sanctuary today, I invite you to consider how you can carry forward the themes that we've explored: grief, change, acceptance, empowerment. How can you hold space for your own grief while also remaining open to new possibilities? Could you use a meditation, do a labyrinth, go on a nature walk, volunteer for a cause close to your heart, or build community? How can you embrace the inevitable changes of life while staying rooted in your deepest values? And how can you reclaim your own sense of empowerment, trusting that even the smallest actions, when taken with love, radical love, can make a profound difference? We are not called to do this work alone. As a community, we are here to support one another, to celebrate our triumphs, and to bear witness to our struggles. Together, we can navigate the complexities of our world and continue working towards a future grounded in justice, compassion, and hope. Before I get to my final slide, I want to name some of these feelings so that they're out in the world and we can hold them as a community together. So I invite you to just speak up, shout it into the ether, and I'll repeat it back for everyone to hear. What are we feeling today about change, acceptance, grief, hope, fear? I rise above. That's beautiful. Overwhelmed. We carry that. Doubt. Doubt creeps in everywhere. At the bottom, that gave me goosebumps. At the bottom of the box, there is hope. Sadness. Anxiety. How appropriate that was said at the same time. Anxiety. That's why we're here today. We'll be having a post-election gathering to hold these feelings of grief, fear, anxiety, doubt, hope, excitement on November 6th at 7 p.m. in the Murray Meeting Room. We can arrange rides for anyone who wants to come but doesn't have access to transportation that night. And may we leave here today feeling a little bit more grounded, a little more helpful, a little bit more hopeful, and a little more empowered to create the world we wish to see. Thank you.